C. Opening remarks at the 2019 BOJ-IMS conference hosted by the Institute for Monetary and Economic Studies. Bank of Japan Haruhiko Kuroda, Governor of the Bank of Japan. Introduction. Good morning. I am honored to welcome such distinguished guests from around the globe to the 25th BOJ-IMS conference. On behalf of the conference organizers, I thank all the guests in this room. This year's conference is titled Central Bank. Design under a continued low inflation and interest rate environment. The current theoretical framework for monetary policy was developed before the global financial crisis. At that time, inflation and interest rates in most advanced economies, with Japan being the notable exception, were high enough to make conventional monetary policy effective. To stimulate the economy, central banks had sufficient safety margins to reduce short-term nominal interest rates. After the global financial crisis, however, this situation changed significantly. Both inflation and nominal interest rates have remained far below their pre-crisis levels for more than a decade. In my opening remarks, I will briefly review the policy agenda for central banks at the moment under a continued low inflation and interest rate environment. 2. Policy agenda under a continued low inflation and interest rate environment. This year's conference focuses on 4 topics: the monetary policy framework, monetary policy instruments, the relationship between price stability and financial stability, and spillovers to emerging and developing economies. A monetary Policy framework. Regarding the monetary policy framework, textbook New Keynesian models assume that long-term inflation expectations are anchored around the inflation target, and the central bank sets the policy rate mechanically. Referring to the natural rate of interest. When these assumptions hold, all that the central bank needs to do to stimulate the economy is to keep real interest rates below the natural rate of interest. However, this conventional policy framework currently faces two major challenges. The first challenge concerns the question to what extent policymakers should rely on the natural rate as a benchmark for monetary policy conduct. This problem is partly associated with the difficulty of measuring the natural rate of interest. Point 1. Of course, this problem can be overcome to some extent by looking at common trends in a range of estimates of the natural interest rate. In fact, various recent estimates of the natural rate of interest suggest that the current level appears to be much lower than before. Giving rise to concerns about a secular decline in the natural rate of interest. The other major challenge is related to the stability of long-term inflation expectations under missing inflation. In fact, a good number of advanced economies have experienced very sluggish price developments in spite of significant improvements in economic activity. This raises concerns over the credibility of inflation targets. Since central banks' track record in hitting their target provides the foundation for the credibility of such targets. Japan's experience shows that it is difficult to re-anchor long-term inflation expectations from inflation below the target level. That suggests the importance of maintaining well-anchored inflation expectations. At the same time, if missing inflation comes from structural factors such as globalization and digitalization, central banks should continue examining how best to manage inflation expectations. While securing stability in economic and financial conditions. Within the flexible inflation targeting framework. B. Monetary policy instruments. Regarding the monetary policy instruments, under normal circumstances, central banks pursue their mandate by adjusting short-term nominal interest rates. However, following the global financial crisis, central banks have been forced to find alternatives, policy instruments. That are often labeled as unconventional, such as forward guidance and the active use of the size and composition. Of their balance sheet, to overcome the effective lower bound on nominal interest rates. The recent experience with regard to unconventional policy shows that such new tools are effective to counter massive adverse shocks even. After hitting the effective lower bound. At the same time, our understanding of unconventional monetary policy is limited. In fact, while policymakers have developed a wide range of unconventional policy tools, their effectiveness and transmission mechanisms may differ depending on financial conditions and economic structure. It is also important to explore how central banks should use those unconventional policy tools in the future. In that regard, an interesting question is, will those unconventional policy tools become conventional policy tools in normal times? Claudia Book, Evidence-Based Policy, Potentials. Infrastructures and the Role of International Organizations, speech by Professor Claudia Buch, Vice President of the Deutsche Bundesbank. At the School of International Studies, ZIS, Dresden, May 24, 2019. One way to promote an evidence-based agenda is to show that evidence-based policy in fact works and that its challenges are common to many fields. Here are 3 examples from financial regulation and supervision. A. Evaluation of financial sector reforms. The global financial crisis has exposed the fault lines in the regulatory system for financial markets. In 2011, G20 members thus agreed on reforms addressing the systemic and moral hazard risks associated with systemically important financial institutions. Policies have been implemented in order to improve loss absorbency and resilience. Recovery and resolution, and supervision. These reforms target more narrowly defined objectives. By focusing on the responses of individual banks, and more broadly defined objectives in terms of aggregate outcomes such as the functioning of financial markets. Many of these reforms have been implemented to date. And a first evaluation of their effects becomes feasible. Such evaluations have to take a structured approach in order to balance an assessment of costs and benefits, and to take a societal rather than private perspective. What appears to be a cost of financial regulation to individual market participants may well be of benefit to society overall by making the system more efficient and resilient. As an instrument to operationalize such complex evaluation projects, the G20 leaders endorsed a framework for the post-implementation evaluation. Of G20 financial regulatory reforms in 2017. The framework provides an umbrella for the financial stability. Boards, FSB, policy evaluation projects and serves as an orientation for the practical conduct of post-implementation evaluations. It rests on two pillars. First, the framework contains provisions regarding the decision-making process and the interaction of relevant stakeholders such as regulators or market participants. This is an important element of transparency and accountability of the FSB. Second, the framework provides guidance on analytical aspects of evaluations and engenders a common understanding of what constitutes good. Evaluations and robust evidence. Regarding analytical guidance, the framework stipulates that each FSB evaluation should answer three key questions. First, did the reforms cause an outcome, attribution? Second, did the reform have similar effects across markets? States of the world, or jurisdictions and regions, heterogeneity. Did the reform achieve its overall objective, general equilibrium? In the spirit of the undogmatic concept outlined above, the answers to these questions should provide detailed information to policymakers on the impact of their policies on observed economic outcomes. They should enable informed policy discussions without preempting decisions regarding adjustments of policies. The first two evaluations. Under the framework were delivered to the G20 summit in November 2018. The first project investigated to what extent. Post-crisis reforms incentivized central clearing of OTC derivatives. The second project evaluated the effect of reforms on the financing of infrastructure. More projects are underway. An evaluation of reform effects on SME. Financing will be delivered to the G20 summit this year with a consultation report published soon, open to comments. From all stakeholders. Another project considering the FSB's reform agenda on ending too big to fail, TBTF, has just started. This evaluation project will assess whether reforms are effective in reducing the systemic and moral hazard risks associated with systemically important banks. It will also examine the broader effects of the TBTF reforms. On the overall functioning of the financial system. The final report is scheduled for the G20 presidency in (2020). Macroprudential policy. Macroprudential policy is a relatively new policy field. Its goal is to preserve financial stability and to prevent the build-up of systemic risk that may have adverse effects for the functioning of the financial system and for the real economy. New institutions have been tasked with the implementation of macroprudential policies. And new policy instruments have been introduced. Nonetheless, uncertainty about the state of the financial system and the effects and effectiveness of these policy instruments is high. This uncertainty entails two risks. The risk of acting too late, inaction bias, and the risk of choosing an inappropriate instrument. Or inadequate calibration. Both risks can be mitigated if macroprudential policy is embedded in a structured policy. Process. Such a policy process involves 4 steps. In a first step, the policy objective, S, of macroprudential policy need to be specified. Macroprudential authorities use different definitions of the policy objective. But all aim at reducing systemic risk arising from externalities for the functioning of the financial system. In a second step, intermediate objectives need to be specified, and appropriate indicators need to be chosen. Intermediate. Objectives are linked to the drivers of systemic risk such as leverage, risk-taking incentives, connectedness. Or exposure to common shocks. In a third step, the activation or recalibration of policy instruments that address systemic risk externalities needs to be considered. The decision on whether and how to activate policy measures should be based on a structured process of ex-ante policy evaluation. Such an ex-ante evaluation provides information about the relative performance of different instruments in contributing to reducing systemic risk. In a fourth step, and once sufficient time has elapsed, the effects of the instruments need to be assessed in an ex post evaluation. This step provides information about the effectiveness of the measure, S, taken, about intended or unintended side effects. And it also serves as an input into a possible recalibration of the policy instruments. In a nutshell, this is what the FSB evaluations mentioned above is about. The macroprudential regulation of residential real estate. Markets in Germany is a good example for how the macroprudential policy cycle can be put into practice. Currently, macroprudential instruments for the real estate market in Germany are not activated. Before activation of an instrument, authorities are required to perform an in-depth ex-ante evaluation. The analysis should quantify the expected impact. For instance, on the resilience of the financial system or on credit markets. The output of such an analysis should inform the calibration process and provide an assessment of the expected costs and benefits. After activation of the instrument, a compulsory ex post evaluation should provide not only information on the instrument's effectiveness but also on potential unintended consequences. The results from this step can then feed into a potential recalibration of the instrument. C. Learning from other policy areas with initiatives such as the one by the FSB. Evidence-based policy has become part of the policy process in the area of international financial regulation. There are other policy areas and international initiatives which can inform this process, with regard to potential avenues to success and pitfalls to be avoided. In order to promote learning from other policy areas and to facilitate a structured dialogue between policymakers and academia, the German National Academy of Science Leopoldina. In cooperation with the Deutsche Bundesbank, organized a workshop in 2018. Here are examples of issues that were addressed in this workshop. In Germany, the Federal Ministry of Finance has been conducting so-called spending reviews since 2018, analyzing revenues and spending decisions and scrutinizing their effectiveness and efficiency. The German National Regulatory Control Council has developed a concept for structuring ex post impact assessments. Applying to all funds spent by the federal government and, more recently, argued in the favor introducing quality. Standards for such evaluations. An area in which policy evaluation in Germany has advanced most are labor market reforms. In the early 2000s, the German government embarked on comprehensive labor market reforms aimed at reducing unemployment. Improving access to work, making new job relationships more sustainable. And enhancing the efficiency of the employment agencies. Public interest in a deeper investigation of the effects of these reforms was sparked by persistently high unemployment rates and the perceived ineffectiveness of policy. There were a number of critical factors that affected evaluations of these policies. First, the evaluation was designed with a view to providing a systematic and broad overview. Second, academic research had a range of appropriate tools available. Making it possible to provide robust results within a reasonably short time span. Third, a mandatory reform evaluation was enshrined in law. Finally, a common concept developed by participating research institutions provided guidance. On practical and analytical aspects of the evaluation. Another example of evidence-based policy is the What Works network. An initiative launched by the British government in 2013. The network consists of independent What Works centers and affiliate members. The What Works Center for Local Economic Growth, for instance, Analyses: which policies are most effective in supporting local economic growth? In practical terms, it reviews and summarizes existing evidence in meta-studies, builds databases on relevant work, or provides guidance to practitioners on how to meaningfully approach evaluations. For example, by providing technical training, supporting piloting and testing local economic schemes, or developing case studies which portray particularly useful evaluation techniques. 3. The role. Of international organizations, evidence-based policy promises huge gains, better policies at potentially lower costs. But evidence-based policy is not a holy grail. It does not overturn the political dynamics that shape policy discussions. However, it does promise a better, more structured, and more informed policy debate. At the national level, electoral cycles have a tendency to work against a structured evaluation of policies. Good institutional design at the national level can thus serve to sustain policies and to ensure bipartisan support to evaluations. The advantage of entrusting independent institutions with evaluations is that they can operate outside the perimeter. Of day-to-day pressure from political debates. At the same time, the further away responsibility for policy. Evaluation is placed from the political discourse, the more political accountability becomes an issue. One mechanism. That can be used to overcome this concern is enhanced transparency, public consultations, transparency with regard to evaluation methods. Replicability of studies, and clear responsibilities are mechanisms to ensure transparency. And thus credibility. International organizations have an important role to play as well. They can enhance transparency about evaluations and institutional designs, rather than getting involved in detailed discussions about national policy design, where national constituencies may question their democratic legitimacy. International organizations can help setting up evaluation frameworks and policy structures. This can be part of their surveillance work. For instance, the European Commission's Better Regulation Guidelines provide guidelines on how the impact of EU regulations should be evaluated. The OECD has published a framework for regulatory policy evaluation. Obviously, objective cross-country evaluations are challenging, if not infeasible. Can we compare the effects of policies? That have been implemented with very different objectives and under very different institutional settings.